It's the most famous 500 miles of motor racing in the world. First run way back in 1911, the Indianapolis 500 has become part of Americana, providing car builders with a racing forum of the highest order. Along the way, legends were made. Hi everybody, I'm Peter Eisler. Welcome to Classics. On today's show, we'll meet some of those legends, the incredible cars that ran at the Brickyard. We're at the California Speedway in Fontana, California, where the modern-day teams are sharing time on the 2-mile oval with an incredible field of vintage Indy cars.
That field spans over 60 years of American open-wheel racing. These cars have been assembled at this magnificent new speedway by the historic Champ and Indy Car Association. The assemblage is like a rolling museum, and exhibition runs show how the cars have evolved over the years.
Well, we're really pleased to be here today, and then we've got about 25 cars here this weekend. And it's something CART asked us to do, so we pulled together a number of cars. Victor Lane Motorsport Marketing, Pam Shatra is our event manager, got on the phone, I got on the phone, and we found that there was a number of cars ready to run, a lot more in garages. We call this a showcase event. Right. It's kind of our inaugural, and the drivers are having a great time.
There was magic in the air as the antique cars rolled onto the tarmac of the ultra-modern super speedway. Anxious drivers staged their cars and waited for their opportunity to get out on the track for a session. Patrick Finney was on hand with his 1929 Gilmore Special. This revolutionary rear-engine 1961 Cooper Climax had owner Philip Dellespine aboard. The field also included more recent Indy cars. Danny Sullivan got reacquainted with his Indianapolis Spin and Win March 85. The first Indy Roadster, designed by Curtis Kraft, the 500, made an appearance piloted by Pac West team owner Bruce McCaw. CART chief steward and former Indy driver Wally Dallenbach brought his 1966 Eagle. Indy's beloved Novi V8 engine echoed its special exhaust note once again in Bob Sutherland's 1935 Miller. As they got out on the circuit and up to speed, the old cars christened the new track with their presence, their roar, and their history.
It gives the people that owns these cars and made the effort to bring them here a rare opportunity to get on a $150 million speedway. There's a real interest not only in the people that own these cars, but the race fans and the competitors, the owners, the drivers, and everything else are really looking fondly at these cars and say, hey, this is what it was about 20, 30 years ago.
Many of these historic oval track cars are not suited to vintage road races, so this was indeed a rare opportunity for them to stretch their legs at speed on an oval, the course they were designed for. A closer look at these beloved open-wheel racers when Classics returns.
Welcome back to Classics. The early years of the Indy 500 saw many rule changes and advances in technology. Many historians consider the 20s to be the golden years of American open-wheel racing. In the 30s, the competition endured the Depression, and more sophisticated cars were to come. All in all, the pre-war years were a time of great change.
Here at the California Speedway was a classic example of those innovative 20s in this 1929 Ford Gilmore. But the restoration of this beautiful two-seater was quite a challenge.
It's a 1929. It was built in Los Angeles, 1929. We did restore the car when we got it. It was kind of in bad shape, whatnot, you know. It was in a private collection. We stripped the paint, and that's when we found the Gilmore lion underneath it, along with a number of other markings that told us basically what kind of car it was. As far as it goes, the body was very straight when we got it, and I think it's original. It's the original radiator. It is the original radiator shroud. It has a motometer, which is very common on all the 20s cars. A motometer really is a thermometer in the radiator itself. There's a little neck that sticks down into the radiator, and that motometer basically, when the water gets hot, the thermometer goes up. This was obviously a very easy thing to see for the driver. 29 came along, they had decided, Indianapolis had decided, the Champ Cars decided to go back to the riding mechanic. And in the riding mechanic, very simply, they widened the body and the chassis to allow for a riding mechanic to go along. The chassis alone, we're not sure exactly what it is. We think it's an early Ford, modified Ford chassis, but it has been modified enough, and you can see the changes they've made in it to allow it to be wider for the second person in the car, along with the extra weight.
With a more modern engine up front, the onboard mechanic can now simply enjoy the ride.
It's from the, I believe, late 30s, early 40s. It's a 6-cylinder. This car is doing probably close to about 100 out there right now, which is pretty quick for a car of this era. Well, we've got 3 carburetors on it right now, 3 Webers on it. They're updated. They're a little newer than the car, but this is what keeps the car running, and I'm really happy we have this engine because it keeps us up with everyone else. And the suspension it's friction shock absorbers, which is pretty common for this era, you know, all through the 20s. We have the racing friction shocks in the front, which were Hartford, and then in the rear we have actually Model A Ford shock absorbers, which are beefed up and fixed up and cleaned up for racing of this era. It's really fascinating to think that the people that have driven these cars, I wish they could see these today, some of the past drivers. I think all the drivers would be thrilled to know that their cars are still running and out there.
During the Depression, a stock block engine formula was imposed. That's when the great technical genius Harry Miller got involved with Ford's championship effort.
My car is one of 10 Miller Fords, which were commissioned by Henry Ford for Harry Miller to build. They were front-wheel drive cars in 1935, and they were to run Ford street engines, flathead street engines of only 150 horsepower. Then this Lou Welsh guy had this engine commissioned, and he said, I want a V8 engine to put in this Miller Ford chassis. We're going to take this 150 horsepower street engine out of here. We're going to put this big V8 in there. So that's what this car is. It has 3 big Winfield carburetors that sit right with me in the cockpit because there's cooler air in there. It has an intercooler, which is a device. It draws cold air from the atmosphere and cools it down, because the cooler the air, the more molecules and the more power that you can get into it. On the car, we left some of the original paint where it says V8, because we got original paint when we got the car. The chassis on the car was the first car to run at Indy with all independent suspension. There are these little nested wishbones. They're short wishbones. The top one covers the bottom one, so they don't really look like wishbones, but they are independent in the back and the front. And it's front-wheel drive. It's been beefed up tremendously because it's got so much more power than it did initially, and it has to be driven very, very carefully. We will hope to get it up to speed, and there is a marvelous noise that it makes, the screaming noise, which I have not heard yet because I haven't been able to run it that fast. So we'll hope to get it up so that the crowd here can hear, and I can hear, the Novi noise.
As the economy rebounded in the late 30s, new, less restrictive engine rules allowed greater innovation. An outstanding example is the Blue Crown Special.
The car was built in 1938 by Joe Linke, but it qualified and ran 5 years at Indianapolis, 1939 through 1947. It was retired in 1948 after running the Milwaukee Mile. It was returned to Joe's office in Chicago. It was parked next to his desk, and that's where it was in 1994 when Joe died at the age of 92. The chassis on Joe's car was unusual in that it was not the usual welded together steel tubes, channels. Rather, it was sheet metal that was riveted, much like the monocoque of the later years. The body itself was built of aluminum on steel channels and all riveted. The craftsmanship for the time to roll and form that aluminum was amazing. There are very few welds in the aluminum. That single piece nose was all formed from one sheet. And truthfully, I don't know how they did it, but it's beautiful.
The Offenhauser engine inside the Blue Crown has all the ingredients of a Miller masterpiece.
The basic engine is a 6-cylinder, dual overhead cam, 2-valve Hemi. It runs 12 to 13 to 1 compression ratio. The engine is 256 cubic inch, which was legal for Indianapolis at the time. And Joe listed the horsepower at 700. There are 4 Winfield side draft carburetors. And what I understand, Winfield made 12 of these carburetors, and now with my 4, all 12 are accounted for. This is the first car at Indianapolis to have 4-wheel disc brakes, and they were ultimately used on the 48 Tucker when it was produced. Front suspension on this car is totally 32 Ford. It has 2 lever action shock absorbers on each side. It has the full transverse spring on the car. Because of the engine weight, it needed that much suspension up front. It is very heavy. This car is like a magnet. Wherever it goes, people have to come and see it. A lot of people say a car that valuable should be in a museum. And I'm a racer. I say a car that runs should be on the track. And the more people see it, the happier it makes me.
The evolution of the American open-wheel racer when Classics returns.
Welcome back to Classics. Coming out of World War II, the dual-purpose dirt track racer still set the pace, but not for long. In fact, Indy was the only open-wheel racetrack that was paved, and that prompted the evolution of a whole new breed of cars, the Roadster.
The specialized design of the Roadster grew out of the post-war cars that had to race on both dirt and pavement. A significant example of these dual-purpose racers is this 1948 Curtiss KK 2000, which was built to excel in unique racing conditions.
At that time, the only pavement race was the Indianapolis Speedway. And every place else, including tracks that we know as paved now, were dirt. It's really a 40s car. Driving position is mainly for dirt, so you're upright and you got a lot of arm leverage to work the large diameter 18-inch wheel to manhandle it through the ruts and the conditions that you find on dirt tracks. The car was built by Curtiss Craft in 1948. It's a 2000 series. It was the second 2000 production car built. It ran at Indy between 1948 and 52, and its best qualifying position was on the pole in 1950, where it qualified at 134 and change. It has a 270 Offie in it with a 2-speed transmission and a quick change rear end. It was a remarkably adaptable motor. It had monstrous torque. It had, for its era, tremendous longevity for a race motor. The transmission has 2 gears, a starting gear for pulling out of the pits and a racing gear. The chassis was 4130 even in those days. It was not a space frame chassis. It was just 4 longitudinal tubes with a web in between them. They were about 6 inches apart, but they were quite flexible, even though they were a breakthrough from a rail frame. After the first year, this car got changed to a transverse front leaf because on the dirt, a lot of drivers felt the transverse leaf worked better. The frontal area was kept to a minimum aerodynamically at that time. It was all aluminum. The bodywork on that car is about 25% original. The rest of it had been damaged so badly over the years that we've had to reproduce it.
The next step for Curtiss was the Roadster. It had a longer wheelbase, and with the engine and drive shaft offset, the driver sat lower and on one side for better balance. The biggest success in the Roadster era came from cars built by A.J. Watson. Tom Malloy tells us about the origins of his 1962 Watson Roadster.
The car is an original Watson Roadster built in 1962 by A.J. Watson and ran that year as a Forbes Special. And if I'm not mistaken, it was actually the Forbes Special for the following 2 years, 63 and 64. This is a Myron Drake Offenhauser. It's known as a 252 cubic inch engine. twin double overhead cams, four valves per piston, normally aspirated. It's about a 255 cubic inch as it sits. It develops about 400 when they're freshly built. In dynoed, it develops about 415 horsepower. The Watson Roadster, or any cars of that era, were very easy, very roomy. Lots of room inside of them. You needed the big steering wheel in those days because, quite honestly, they were going so fast at that time with what they had that you didn't want to make any sharp movements to the small wheel. The wheel was there for a certain reason. I mean, it's if you've seen a farm tractor, it's the same steering that's on this Watson Roadster, and it was on through all the cars until the rear engine cars came out. You know, it's just a steering shaft that runs down to a set of gears that go 90 degrees to the outside of the car, and on the end is the pitman arm that actuates the drag link that ties into the whole front end suspension. You know, the Roadsters probably came as close to aerodynamics as anything, because again, like I say, that was a period that more engineering went into racing than at any time prior to that.
Number 76 ran and completed 4 Indy 500s from 62 through 65. It was driven by Shorty Templeman, Gordon Johncock, and Jim McElreath, and was the last roadster to compete at Indy. Classics returns with some examples of cars from the mid-engine revolution.
Welcome back to Classics. The decade of the 60s marked the end of the line for the Roadster and the beginning of the mid-engine revolution. Modeled after the more sophisticated European Grand Prix cars, they were lower, better handling, faster around the curves. By 1965, the big burly Roadster was gone from the field.
The roots of the 1961 Kimberly Cooper Special can be found in John Cooper's Grand Prix cars of the late 50s. It almost won the Indy 500.
They showed up at Indianapolis the 5th of May, 1961. They finished in 9th place. They were as high as 3rd at one time. If they had been running the Firestone tires, they probably would have won the race.
With the Indy 500's special requirements, the Grand Prix-inspired Kimberly Cooper is its own car.
The car is actually quite different. The wheelbase is longer by 2 inches. The track is wider by 1 inch on each side, and the suspension is offset along with the body with a much bigger tank on the left side, of course. The car generally is stronger and is probably the best Cooper ever built as far as the quality, due to the fact the USAC people were very picky. The car was lighter by about 400 pounds than the typical Watson or Curtis chassis. The engine was much lighter. The Offie engine is 380 pounds, almost 400 pounds. This engine is more like 280 pounds. The engine developed 260 horsepower and mostly has much greater torque than the Formula One. The gearbox also is a 3-speed box instead of the 5-speed for the Formula One, but using the same casing. The clutch is very much the same, and the wheels also are knockoffs instead of bolt-ons. Driving the car is pretty simple. This car is like a pre-war car. You slide it around. It's extremely predictable, and it comes out of the corner nicely.
Like many former race cars, in its later life, the Kimberly Cooper was nearly modified into extinction.
When we got the car, the chassis was cut to the point where only the front of the chassis was together, and all the other tubes were in a box, all sawed off. The engine had holes that big in it, and we had to literally re-engineer the car from the ground up. And of course there are no prints in existence, there were never any prints, and it was very difficult. What we had was the body, so we had to fabricate the chassis to fit the body rather than the body to fit the chassis, which is very unusual. It was very, very hard. Virtually everything you see are the old parts redone, rebuilt, which is exceptional because it never happens nowadays.
Cooper's debut at Indy sparked a revolution, opening the floodgates for mid-engine cars. This 1966 Gurney Eagle, driven by CART's Wally Dallenbach, was part of the first generation of Grand Prix-derived Indy cars.
The first car race that I won in Milwaukee was with a 1973 Dan Gurney built car. I thought at that time, in that era, he was parallel to A.J. Watson building the Roadsters. This car here had a whole new feel to it, and it was like a Cadillac. First of all, you're sitting in the middle of the car where the ride is at its best, and you have all that noise and sound behind you, and the only thing you have to worry about is those two front wheels in front of you. And of course the engine, the Offie engine, was virtually used by everyone. It produced about 800 horsepower. Actually, that particular engine could run up to 1,000 horsepower to qualify. We didn't know any better. We thought that was, you know, really high-tech stuff. But I've driven cars that are full ground effects cars, and I know what the difference is. I'm still amazed at its power, because it still has the power that we have today. But the handling characteristics that I thought was so great, it's really pretty crude. They're pretty scary yet.
Wally's son Paul took his turn at the wheel of his dad's old car.
You know, it's great driving something that my dad's driven. It shows that us drivers today are kind of wimps. I mean, it's a lot of straight line speed and then no grip in the corners. It's amazing. It's a lot of fun.
The science of aerodynamics makes its mark on Indy when Classics returns. Welcome back to Classics. After mid-engine cars took over American open-wheel racing, aerodynamic science was the next technological threshold. This 1970 Eagle was part of the new era.
At that time, the car had no wings at all on it, with the exception of a small whale tail on the back and little winglets on the nose and the front. The car evolved over the succeeding 4 years, but the wings that you see on the car today came along in about 1974. Both the front wing and the rear wing have a small detail on the trailing edge called a gurney lip or gurney flap. There's actually about a 1/4 inch of L-shaped aluminum on the top surface that creates a turbulence there and assists in the downforce. This car is a monocoque construction. It has no tubes as an inner structure. The sheet metal is bent and folded and riveted in such a way that it's a structural part of the car itself. And the result is a bit more rigid car. I think the fit and finish is just excellent. The front suspension is a wishbone on the bottom and a rocker arm on the top with coilover shocks. I think this was fairly conventional for that era. Originally, the car had a turbocharged Offenhauser engine, but the owner of the car in 1974 installed a small block Chevrolet. So I think it's a more tractable engine. It's a larger displacement, more torque, more flexibility. Well, I guess what's fascinating to me about Dan Gurney and his Eagles is the many, many years that he's been involved in building cars. I think it's something that's fairly unique in American racing.
American open-wheel race cars have thrilled the world for over 9 decades. It's their raw power and sometimes elegant design, combined with their history, that have made these vintage cars so very special. I hope you've enjoyed today's show. Until next time, I'm Peter Eisler, saying so long for Classics.
Classics is a WATV production in association with Speed Vision Network.